This is video SLA 1, Comprehensible Input. Today we're going to look at the first principle of language acquisition, which we'll call comprehensible input. We're going to look at comprehensible input through the lens of a model that has been around for a very long time. This model is called the filter monitor model. And the reason that we're presenting this model is because as you become familiar with the literature in teaching English language learners, this model, this idea of comprehensible input comes up a lot. I'll introduce the model, and then at the end of the video we'll talk about some problems that we have with the model in the field and how we can kind of move beyond that. The beginning of the model is what we call input. Input is all of the oral and written language in our environment. When you first learn a language, that input is largely incomprehensible. It's just a stream of words, a stream of sound, or a stream of shapes. That input eventually, and we'll talk about how, that input eventually becomes intake, which goes to our brains. We'll call the part of our brain that processes language, that is the language there is what we'll call our developing language system, or interlanguage. When we're learning a language, that system is in constant flux, meaning it's constantly developing and changing. In this model, the authors of this model describe this kind of learning, your developing language system, as acquisition. And what they mean by that is that it's an unconscious process. We don't know about the specific rules of our language. This happens, and it happens in a very systematic or rule-governed way. In other words, people are creative with language. They don't just mimic what they hear, they actually are creative. So they create rules, and hear rules, and modify those rules in this interlanguage that's constant development and constant flux. Finally, the authors of this model argued that language was innate. Our ability to learn language is something we're born with. We're born with this kind of pre-wired ability to learn language, and that it somehow separates us from other animals. Language is really special. From our developing language system, our brain, we have input that becomes intake, and then we process that language, and then we speak. And we either speak or we write, and that's what we call output. And we can measure output and learn how people's language is developing. The authors of this model proposed two constructs that influence this flow from input to intake to a developing language system to output. You'll notice the arrows all go in one direction. The first construct is what they called the filter. And what they meant by the filter were, when you're learning a language, sometimes you feel really inhibited, really uncomfortable. Sometimes you're in classes and it's really boring and you feel really unmotivated, you're demotivated to learn. And you just have a bad attitude because the experience all in all is not a very good experience. And what they described for this kind of situation, they called it a filter. And the idea was that the filter blocked this input, and therefore there was nothing really to take into your developing language system because you just really weren't listening and you just didn't care. You had bad attitude, so this was somehow blocking out all this good stuff, the language, the input. So nothing was going to your language system. Another construct that they propose is what's called the monitor, and by this they contrasted the monitor to the sort of the more natural way of our acquisition. So in other words, rather than acquiring a language unconsciously, you learn a language consciously, and when you go, say, learning a second language, learning grammar rules, learning explicit types of language features, and being able to talk about about those and identify them. You know, this classroom learning, they described as the monitor. Even if you've not learned another language, you've probably experienced your monitor at work. When you give a formal presentation or when you're writing an essay, you can go back and check. So it's all the stuff that we know about a language, but it's not necessarily acquisition. And the idea was that if we just focus on the monitor and conscious learning, then that also could affect the filter and make people unhappy because they don't really learn that much. They don't feel very engaged in the language, and so that might raise the filter. So both the filter and the monitor were considered things to reduce in this model. One of the important features of the filter-monitor model was this notion of input plus one, or I plus one. So in other words, in the input, your teacher would provide input that was just slightly above a student's current level of ability. This will make you think of scaffolding, for example. When we scaffold a learner, we work within that learner's zone of proximal development. Well, it's the same kind of idea where we have input that's just slightly above a learner's current level of ability. And that was the perfect kind of comprehensible input. Input that the student could understand, that there would be enough new features, vocabulary, grammar, all that would push a developing language system to grow. And so the idea was to lower the filter so that input would become intake, the language system would develop, and the monitor, we wouldn't worry about those formal language skills. So the authors of the model proposed something like this. You lower your filter, input becomes intake, the language system grows, and that would be the ideal case for language acquisition. This is the end of the first part of video SLA 1 called Comprehensible Input. Let's pause here and we'll do a little test, and then we'll move on to section 2